Okay, I want to welcome everyone back to the third session of talks at the 9th Eubank's Conference on World Markets. Our first speaker is Chris Anderson, Dr. Chris Anderson, from the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's a professor of European politics and policy. Chris's first teaching job after he finished his doctorate at the University of Washington in St. Louis was here at Rice. We are glad to have him back, at least virtually. And he's going to be speaking on playing the numbers game, analysis and decision-making in elite soccer. So, Chris, take it away.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. I'm going to share my screen if that's all right. All right, here we go. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming. I suppose a big hello back to Houston, where I spent several really wonderful years, and it's a real pleasure to be back at Rice, at least virtually, and I can't wait to come back to campus someday soon. I loved my time at Rice, where I started my academic career, as was just mentioned, and these days I'm hanging around the London School of Economics. So, but I'm not going to tell you about political science or my time at Rice. What I'm really going to do is tell you some stories about data and decision-making in soccer. And so let me it's sort of a play in 3 acts. So let me get going on what I want to tell you about. There's a bit of a setup here, and I'm going to give you kind of a really, really short history of data in soccer. It's a simple story, but it's a different story from what you might know about the history of data in American sports, and certainly the history of data in a sport like baseball, which we all know from the story of Moneyball. So to make the point about the use and availability of data in soccer, let me show you a picture. Now, if you're a fan of soccer, you may know who some of these people are. It's a picture of the famous so-called boot room at Liverpool Football Club. And you might recognize maybe Kenny Dalglish there on the left, for instance. And the boot room is the room where literally the boots were kept, or what we call cleats in the US, in a club. And at Liverpool, it was famous for being the place where the coaching staff hung out after training, before games, or all week long. And they weren't always drinking tea as they are in this particular picture. You can see the ashtray there on the table as well. So this is where the brain trust of one of the world's most successful and storied football clubs made decisions when it came to how we play the game and who might play the game. But they did that with a lot of tea, perhaps, good cheer, good gut feelings, but no data. So you might wonder kind of why that would be. Baseball is a sport where we've had a lot of information, certainly from fans and others over the many years. But the reason is quite simple. Soccer just doesn't have a history of widely available data about players or teams. Not only were the data not available, but people weren't looking for them. It's the culture of the sport. It was a working class sport, working class entertainment that started in the late 19th century here in England. So it means that the people both running it and watching it did not have a culture of caring about numbers so much as they cared about just entertainment on a Saturday afternoon. And it was a business run by ex-players. And the sport itself has something to do with it as well. It's the most low scoring of all the team invasion sports. It's the sport where there are some rare events, goals, that matter an awful lot, but they don't happen very much. And so one of the things to kind of keep in mind about the history of soccer statistics is that we basically had sort of basic reports about who played whom, what was the scoreline, what was the score at halftime, who was on the pitch, who got a yellow card or a red card, maybe what the attendance was, and that was just about it for many, many years, certainly when I was growing up still. But that world of no data or not enough data really has been turned upside down just within the last decade or so. So this is a sport that's been around well over 100 years. There's been this literal, no, not literal, but figurative avalanche of information that's rained down on clubs. It hasn't been a gradual change. There hasn't been a culture of paying attention to numbers. It's been a complete sea change in football, or what we call soccer in the US, that's been brought on by sort of several changes coming together. One of them is technology. The ownership of clubs has changed significantly, certainly here in England, with, as we now famously know, Americans investing more and more in clubs over here. The financial stakes have gotten bigger. And so all these things coming together have meant that we now have lots of data. We're living in an age of big data anywhere we look, outside of sport, of course. And within soccer itself, the volume, variety, and velocity of data has increased hugely. And the thing to know, of course, about soccer is that it's a fairly complex game. So it's not a discrete game of discrete events. It's a free-flowing game. And what that means is that there are lots of data, lots of complex data, and a lot of people would say perhaps almost too much data. We can measure every touch of the ball, every movement of the ball, the XYZ coordinates of everyone and everything, positions that are measured 10 times per second, the running of players, distance, velocity, direction, heartbeats, tactical awareness in training, in matches. We can measure training loads and exercises, psychological profiles, injuries. We have data on every player in every league of every country in the world. And as we know, soccer is the one truly global sport, and that means tens of thousands, if not over 100,000 players that we keep tabs on, down to the U14 level. And so there's been this sort of radical revolution of lots of information becoming available to professional football clubs and people making decisions within football clubs. But the problem is that they haven't quite managed to cope. And what that's really meant is that there hasn't been very much insight, perhaps, yet. There's been all these data have generated a lot of heat, but not necessarily nearly as much light as you might imagine. So data isn't insight, right? And of the hundreds of professional teams, very few have well thought out approaches to dealing with data and analytics, despite what you might read in the news. And very few have extracted genuine insights from those data. And very few, and fewer still, have made data a part of their strategy as football clubs. In fact, they're just struggling most of the time to keep up with the avalanche. So if that's sort of the back history of data and soccer, let me move on to the second part of the story. Please indulge me for a second and allow me to take a walk down memory lane. And for me, aside from Rice, part of my back history is that I was a professor at Cornell. And so for me, the football story, the soccer story, starts on the Cornell campus. Here to be exact, if you really want to know. And one day I was reading a story about a football coach. And it wasn't just any old football coach. It was this gentleman. And if you follow soccer, you will know immediately who this is. This is, of course, the most winningest coach there ever was in the English game, Sir Alex Ferguson, who's won more trophies, won more championships than anyone ever out there, right? So he's coach of Manchester United for 27 years, a bit like the Vince Lombardi of soccer, right? So here's the winningest coach in history. And one day he was asked by a journalist what his biggest mistake had been. And he thought about it for just a quick second. He said, well, there's a story I can tell you about how I sold this Dutch defender by the name of Jaap Stam in 2001 to Lazio Rome. And Ferguson then kind of continues to tell that story about how he had noticed that Stam was making fewer tackles after coming back from a serious injury, and sort of counting the tackles, so to speak. An analyst had helped him figure out kind of how much tackling there was that the defenders were doing. He had sort of thought that maybe the data showed him that Stam had lost a step. It was time to get rid of him. He was 29 years old, kind of on the back end of his career, and it was probably a smart move to cash in on him and find somebody else who will take him off his hands. The interesting thing about the Jaap Stam story, of course, was that he went on to have several more really successful years as a defender. And in hindsight, Ferguson regretted having sold him. So when I was reading that story, I tried to kind of figure out and think to myself, what is the mistake that Ferguson made? Here's a guy who lives and breathes the game and has won more trophies as a coach than anyone else. And yet he made this mistake that in hindsight, he fears he shouldn't have made. And I think the mistake he made was that he didn't fully appreciate what the data were telling him. And in my mind, the way I tell the story is that he didn't hear the dogs that didn't bark. So let me tell you what I mean by that. So for that, let's go from this building where my office used to be and walk across the arts quad at Cornell to another building where I had a colleague in the psychology department by the name of Tom Gilovich. Now, you may have heard of Tom Gilovich or read some work by him. He was a huge basketball fan. In his free time, played, I think, every day, pickup games every day. But he's an even more famous psychologist, and of course, one of the co-authors of the original hot hand study in basketball that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So Tom told me this really interesting story. I was telling him about Alex Ferguson and how Ferguson had sold Stam because he was making fewer tackles. And Tom told me about some interesting research in the field of cognition and decision making. So with your permission, get ready. I'm going to run a little experiment with you, as psychologists tend to do. So first, here's Tom, just in case you needed to have a reminder of what he looks like. Sorry. So let me run this experiment with you. So here's the setup. I'm going to show you a bunch of circles with a small line through them, kind of like a cue. See how long it takes you to find the one circle that doesn't have a line through it. In other words, where the line is absent. Okay? Ready? Here we go. There. Do you see it? Okay. So now let's do something else. Now I'm going to show you a bunch of circles without a line, except for one. See how long it takes you to see it. Ready? Now, if you're anything like me, or the hundreds of people with whom I've had lots of fun showing these pictures to, the second one will have been a lot quicker than the first one. And psychologists have an explanation for that. People have trouble seeing things that aren't there. We have trouble hearing the dogs that don't bark, but research from psychology shows that people have a tendency to discount things that are absent or not notice things that are absent and augment the importance of causes that are present, things that happen. And I think this influences how we think about football. It's the most low-scoring game among the big sports. And as a result, not only do we consider the goals that our team scores to be more important than the ones they don't concede, but we value the tackles they make more highly than the challenges they don't have to make because of their sense of positioning, their game intelligence, and all of that, right? So if you think about the Ferguson and Jaap Stam story on tackling, as a general rule, when we're trying to explain an outcome we see in the world, we think harder about things and assign causal force to things that happen than those that don't. And this is a really important part of sort of understanding soccer statistics generally, understanding the game of football. And this is a story that we tell, that Dave Sally and I tell in our book, The Numbers Game. Here's my co-author, Dave, just in case you wanted to look him up one of these days. And in The Numbers Game, we tell the story of Jaap Stam and Ferguson and a few others, but we also try to explain kind of what makes soccer unique from a numerical perspective. And so the key parameters that we need to keep in mind is its low-scoring nature, where sometimes 0 can be greater than 1. I'll explain to you in a second what I mean by that. And it's a team sport where the parts matter an awful lot. And so, as the saying goes, not everything that counts can be counted. So now, let me move on to showing you some actual soccer numbers and telling you some stories about actual soccer numbers. All right, so let's get into playing the numbers game. Now, playing the numbers game, sitting in Ithaca, New York, isn't all that easy, it turns out, right? London, The unofficial headquarters of global football is quite a ways away. It's literally an ocean away. And so what I did was I left Cornell, I went on leave, and I moved to London, where I then started advising various stakeholders in football, including owners and people who run clubs. And I also had the great privilege to run a professional club in England for a little while. These days, I'm back in academia at the LSE, and my work in football revolves around advising owners and investors in football clubs. And of course, as in so many walks of life, numbers can help with that. So here's a very basic question you might get asked, or you might ask yourself: how much should you pay for a striker? Or how much should you pay for a goalkeeper? Right? These are questions you may want to know as a participant in the market, how to value these assets that football clubs own, or at least rent for a while, right? So for one way to think about the answer, we can think about presence and absence, and I'll do that in a second. Another answer would simply be to look at what the going rate is, right? Kind of what is the market saying, and we can just pay the market rate. And these days, of course, there's the internet, and we can Google it, and we can see kind of how much players are worth. There's a really interesting website called Transfermarkt, and it's a crowdsourced sort of site. And here's the list of the 10 most valuable players in the world at this present time. So we can quibble about the specific values, of course, but what do you see? Is there a pattern in what kinds of players do you see listed? One of the things you'll see is these are players from big clubs, right? Big famous clubs: PSG, Liverpool, Real Madrid. Oh, Real Madrid is not in there actually. Wonder why. Manchester City, Dortmund, and so on, right? So that's one pattern. Big players play for big clubs. That's not surprising, is it? The other thing that you'll quickly figure out is that they're all players whose job it is to score goals, except for one, right? The one exception here is Trent Alexander-Arnold from Liverpool. He's a right back, but everyone else's job is to score goals. The top 10 players, or the top 9 players, are all players who are playing forward, right? And so this is consistent with the history of transfer values. This isn't just a 2021 kind of phenomenon, right? If you think about who's won the Ballon d'Or, the biggest individual achievement award in football, it's almost always been attacking players. There's only 4 vaguely defensive players in the history of the Ballon d'Or, which has been around, I think, for over 50 years. The market for football players loves strikers, the people whose job it is to score goals. Now, when we look at kind of benchmarking values for the average player, we can simply look at player values, say in any given league, for instance. And here's done some analyses that we did of player market values. These are historical valuation ratios across different positions in the Premier League. And if you're not a fan of soccer, sort of as we move up the field toward the opposition goal, kind of these are the positions that players play, right? So we've got the goalkeeper, defenders, midfielders, and strikers, right? As we move up the field, players become more expensive. Clearly, the market loves players who score goals and values them more highly than those whose job it is to prevent them. So why is it so appealing to the market? Why do we love strikers so much? Do they actually matter more? Are they actually more important in the game of football? Remember, first of all, soccer is a team sport, right? It's a sport of goal difference. So does it make sense to value strikers relative to goalkeepers and defenders by multiples of over 2 or 1.67 roughly? Or how should we think about this? So to make sense of that, it's also important to keep in mind something I mentioned briefly earlier, namely, it's the most low scoring of the team sports, and by some distance, right? Despite the 95 minutes of running around and touching and chasing the ball and each other, the events that truly matter are really rare, and I'll show you in a second how rare they are. So one great moment or one mistake often makes the difference and is decisive. It's also the most unpredictable of the team sports. I'll show you some evidence on that in a second as well. Of course, draws are reasonably common, right? And then finally, there's an interesting non-linearity in the rewards. Remember, if you follow soccer or don't follow soccer, you get 0 points for a loss, you get 1 point for a draw, and you get 3 points for a win, right? So a win is 3 times as valuable as a draw. Now, that has some really interesting implications. So what are the odds? So let me just show you really quickly the success rates of pre-game favorites, right? And what we did is collected a bunch of data on the pre-game odds of matches in team handball, which is a sport played here in Europe quite a bit, the NBA, the NFL, and MLB, right? Where we looked simply at, did the pre-game favorite end up winning the game? And you can sort of see the different team sports here, somewhere between 60 and 70%. Let me show you where soccer is in all of this. Here's soccer, right? So the pre-game favorite was only slightly, had odds of slightly better than 50% to actually turn out to be the winner. Now, soccer is different, folks, right? So let's think about the most common scores in soccer. Turns out, you probably know this already, the most common score is a 1-1 tie. Now, these are data from the English Premier League. We looked at the other big leagues in Europe. It's a very, very common pattern, right? Actually, the average number of goals is somewhere around 2.7, 2.8 in the big leagues, which means each team on average scores about 1.3, 1.4 goals in a game. So the most common score is a 1-1 tie, followed by a 1-0 win by the home game and a 2-1 home victory, right? So 89% of matches, neither team scores more than 2 goals. And now, how might that affect how we think about strikers and valuing players in the market? To do that, let's think about how much a goal is actually worth. So what we can do here is think about the value of a goal to a team, right? So the goal of the analysis is to predict points from goals. And here what we did was take 10 years of Premier League match data. So 38 matches times 10 years times 2 teams. We've done this for thousands of matches all across the European top leagues. And frankly, the results change very, very little. And of course, we can think about this as sort of the production of a team on the offensive and defensive end, and whether it actually produces certain desirable team outcomes, right? So let me walk you through this very, very simple example. I know this is probably a conference where people have all kinds of sophisticated understandings of quantitative information, but I think getting the essential features right is a really, really important part of the story. So when we score, this is sort of the line for scoring goals, right? So when we score a goal, it gives us, our team, a little over a point on average. And if you know anything about Premier League football, you know that get a point per game roughly keeps you in the league, right? 38 points per season roughly, so keeps you from getting relegated, right? So that's great. And if you score 2 goals, if you manage to score 2, you get roughly a little over 2. So you get halfway between a draw and a win. This is great, right? So the more goals we score, the more likely we are to win. Scoring goals is obviously valuable, right? But let's think about the dogs that don't bark or bark very little. So let's go back and think about conceding goals and how conceding or not conceding goals translates into points won and lost. And so when we score a goal, as we saw, we get a little over a point. But when we concede just 1 goal in a game, we win more points. So just conceding 1 gets you roughly 1.5 points. But the real kicker is here. Not conceding a goal in this really low scoring game wins you on average almost 2.5 points per game. So what that means is that scoring a goal is less valuable than not conceding one, or just conceding 1. So now what do we make of the values of Premier League players and the ratios and the multiples of players in the market? Now you may want to think differently about the value of these players. Of course, everything being equal, I understand that. There might be commercial value attached to being a glamorous, flamboyant striker as opposed to a dour, solid defender. But this struck us as a particularly interesting example of an inefficiency in the market. Because remember, it's not about scoring goals. It's about maximizing goal difference. So let me tell you a little bit about what football clubs have done about these values in the last couple of years. Not coincidentally, football clubs with some of the very best and most advanced data analysts in the business have taken note. They've made some decisions based on this. And let me talk about what those are. Let me just show you some pictures on that. Liverpool signed Southampton defender for world record £75 million. In dollars at the time, that was 100 million bucks. Manchester City signing a defender for a record fee at the end of 2017. Who else keeps goals out? Obviously, goalkeepers. Liverpool made Brazil's Alisson the most expensive goalkeeper in the world. And of course, Chelsea signed Athletic Bilbao's goalkeeper in a world record deal as well. All of a sudden, these top clubs, these really sophisticated clubs, started spending money on defenders. The kinds of money, if you remember that top 10 list of market values for players just a few minutes ago, the kind of money that you used to have to pay for top strikers. At the top end, the market for players has changed, where defenders and goalkeepers have become much more valuable to the top clubs. And one of the reasons has to do with people like the gentleman on the left here. That's Dr. Ian Graham. He's got a PhD in theoretical physics, and he is Liverpool's top data analysts. And they have hired, I think, 3 or 4 people with PhDs in physics and mathematics. And there was an interesting New York Times story. If you're interested, New York Times Magazine story, if you're interested in kind of the backstory of how data brought Liverpool to the cusp of glory, it's a really interesting kind of backstory about what they do in that football club, right? And so what they've done is they've really invested in making sure they get the most out of the data that exists now, right? And so they're doing it probably in, they're one of the clubs that do among the most advanced jobs in the business altogether. And it's no surprise, it's no accident, of course, that this football club is owned by people who wanted to make this guy their GM for the Boston Red Sox, right? It's the Fenway Sports Group and John Henry and his people. And of course, they believe in data. They believe in the approach of making decisions with the help of data. And Liverpool, one of those examples where that's really paid off in a really, really big way. And so what I want to do is just leave you with an interesting quote from the patron saint of data analytics and sports. I think it's just very apropos, especially when we're talking about seeing things that aren't there. And that is really the story of absence and presence in football. And I hope you found this a little bit interesting, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Chris, thanks very much. Yeah, it is interesting, the different dynamics of the different sports. And when you score so few goals, how do you come up with a good criterion measure? We got a question, and basically it says, when your opponent cannot score a goal when you have the ball. A good offense automatically translates into a good defense. Do you agree?
By definition, when we've got the ball, they don't. So by definition, this statement has to be true. The trouble with that is that it's very, very difficult to generate enough offense long enough over the course of 95 minutes so that you can completely prevent the opposition from scoring. And I'm sure that's not what you're saying. But it is true that having more possession of the ball also helps your defensive stats, right? Which is why when you see teams like Manchester City, for instance, who have a lot of the ball, or Barcelona, who have a lot of the ball, they're able to generate good defensive outcomes. Now, so there's many ways to skin a cat. And I think one of the interesting things about soccer is that there isn't kind of the holy grail. So there's this quest for the solution for how to win a soccer game, in my mind, is a bit of a fool's errand, to be perfectly honest, because it is such a complex game, and there's many different strategies for how to win a game. And so having a lot of the ball is definitely one of those ways you can do it, but it takes very expensive players, so it's not necessarily the most efficient way to do it. You need a lot of skill on the ball. You need a lot of very talented guys, because a pass, if you think about possession, a pass, it doesn't just involve one player. Of course, it involves always at least two players, right? To play a pass successfully means somebody has to be able to receive it and do something else with it. So a third and fourth and fifth person in the chain is able to be there, receive the ball, and pass it. And so possession is truly a team game that requires a lot of really skillful players. And it's an expensive way to keep the ball out of the goal, I guess is really what I would say.
Okay, I believe we have time for at least one more question. First of all, it's an anonymous attendee saying, fantastic talk, which I concur. Is Liverpool's current season just noise, the error term, or have other teams caught up dramatically?
Yes. It's all of the above, right? So a couple of things about that. It's a really good question, actually, and maybe and hopefully this person isn't a Liverpool fan. But I think the interesting thing about soccer is that the season isn't long enough. So when we compare the sort of the predictability of a team's performance for its final standing in the tables, because there are only 38 games in the season, there's still a lot of noise around kind of a divergence between performance and actual final table position. We estimate that the season would have to be somewhere around 60 games long for a lot of that noise to cancel out. And so what that means is that almost inevitably, every season there will be a few teams that are going to get caught up in the variance. And that variance is really a killer, which is why an analytical approach to soccer really only makes sense as a longer term project, not a one-season project. Other teams also are starting to catch up. Some of the other big teams have genuinely invested a fair amount of money in ramping up their analytics operations, and they've started to hire some very, very good people with high levels of skills to make sense of a lot of the complex data. I think it's going to be interesting to see. It's not quite an arms race yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if within the next 5 years we will see an arms race for talent off the pitch. One of our theses is that the investment you make off the pitch is going to be the big decider going forward.
Okay, Chris, thanks very much. Yeah, baseball, of course, obviously has the best history, longest history, but still their prediction models that are incredibly accurate still just predict within plus or minus 2 games of an overall record, and that can be anywhere from leading the conference to not even being in the playoffs. So
that's right.
All right. Okay, well, thank you very much.